In the days when Gil-galad yet held dominion over Lindon, and the shadow of Sauron first stirred in the east, there came to the court of King Thranduil of Erin Lasgalen a messenger bearing tidings most dire. The autumn winds carried with them not only the golden leaves of Malorn trees, but whispers of treachery that would shake the very foundation of elvish nobility. King Thranduil, whose line traced back to the elder days when Orifer led his people across the misty mountains, sat upon the throne of stars in his great hall. The messenger, one Mithrellis of the Galadrim, bore the seal of Celeborn himself. Her face was pale as moonlight upon snow, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "My lord," she began, her words echoing in the vast chamber adorned with carved images of the two trees. "Dark news I bring from Lothlorien. Prince Thranduil, your son and heir, stands accused of a crime most heinous." The king's eyes, blue as the depths of the Sea of Rhûn, narrowed. "Speak plainly, daughter of the Golden Wood. What accusation do they lay upon my son?" "The murder of Lord Celebdil of the Noldor, kinsman to Gil-galad himself. They say elven blood stains the prince's hands, and the High King demands his surrender for judgment." A silence fell upon the hall like the shadow of a great eagle. The courtiers, resplendent in their robes of silver and green, dared not breathe. For in all the long years since the awakening of the firstborn, no elf had raised hand against another in such manner. King Thranduil rose slowly from his throne, his crown of mithril and emeralds catching the light of the great chandeliers. "Where is my son now?" "He has fled, my lord, into the depths of Mirkwood, where even the light of Arundil's star grows dim. The wise say he seeks something in those dark places, something that may clear his name or damn him utterly." 7 days passed ere the king's decision was made known. In the depths of Thranduil's palace, where the great roots of ancient trees formed living pillars, messengers were dispatched to every corner of the woodland realm. The prince was to be found and brought before his father, that the truth might be discerned. Yet it was not the king's guards who first took up the hunt, but 3 unlikely companions. Gelmir the Bold, captain of the palace guard and friend to the prince since their youth. Nimrodel, a maiden of the Nandor whose skill with bow was legendary even among the Galadrim. And most surprising of all, Faramir of Ithilien, a mortal man who had earned the king's trust through deeds of valor in the war against the orcs of the Misty Mountains. They set forth on the first day of winter, when the stars of Menelvegor stood bright in the southern sky. Their path led them deep into the heart of Mirkwood, where the enchanted river wound its treacherous course through valleys shrouded in perpetual twilight. "Tell me truly, Gelmir," spoke Nimrodel as they rode beneath the eaves of the forest. "Do you believe the prince capable of such a deed?" The Thranduil I knew was quick to anger, perhaps, but never cruel. Gelmir's face was grim beneath his helm of burnished steel. "The prince has been strange of late, distant and brooding. There are whispers that he has been delving into lore better left forgotten, seeking answers to questions that should not be asked." Faramir, his mortal eyes struggling to pierce the gloom that seemed natural to his elvish companions, spoke with the wisdom of one who had seen much sorrow. "In my experience, those who seek forbidden knowledge oft find more than they bargained for. Perhaps your prince discovered something that drove him to desperate action." As the hunters pressed deeper into Mirkwood, following signs and rumors of the prince's passage, they came at last to the ancient fortress of Amon Lang, which in elder days had been fair Dol Guldur ere the necromancer made it his stronghold. Though Sauron had long since returned to Mordor, still the hill was shunned by all wise folk, for evil leaves its mark upon the very stone. Yet here the trail led them, and here they found signs of recent habitation. In a chamber deep beneath the ruined tower, they discovered a camp hastily abandoned, and with it scrolls and books that made even Gelmir's elvish blood run cold. "These are texts of the dark arts," whispered Nimrodel, her face pale in the light of their torches. "See here, incantations for speaking with the dead, rituals for binding spirits to one's will." Why would Prince Thranduil seek such knowledge? Faramir, whose studies in Minas Tirith had acquainted him with dark lore, examined the writings with growing unease. These are not merely the work of Sauron or his servant. See this script? It is Quenya, the high tongue of the Noldor. This knowledge comes from the firstborn themselves. As if summoned by his words, a voice echoed from the shadows of the chamber, cold and mocking. Indeed, mortal, you show wisdom beyond your kind. From the darkness stepped a figure that made all three companions reach for their weapons. Tall and fair he was, as all the firstborn, but about him clung an aura of menace that spoke of long years spent in contemplation of forbidden things. His eyes were gray as winter sea, and upon his brow was a circlet of black mithril. Lord Celebdil, breathed Gelmir, but you are said to be dead, slain by Prince Thranduil's hand. The elf lord smiled, and it was a terrible thing to behold. Dead? Nay, Captain, though perhaps it would be kinder to say so. I am changed, and it is Prince Thranduil who has wrought this change upon me. In the shadow of that accursed place, Celebdil spoke of treachery and betrayal that went back to the elder days. He told of how he had come to Thranduil with word of a great discovery, ancient texts hidden in the ruins of Ostin Edhil, the city of the elves in Eregion, where once Celebrimbor had forged the rings of power. Within those texts, said Celebdil, his voice like wind through dead leaves, lay the secret of the 7 Palantiri, and more beside, knowledge of how the seeing stones were made, and how others might be crafted. Think you what power such knowledge would bring to those wise enough to use it? Nimrodel's eyes flashed with sudden understanding. You sought to create new Palantiri, to give the free peoples a weapon against the Dark Lord's sight. Aye, nodded Celebdil, but the prince had other ideas. He spoke of using such stones not to watch for enemies, but to peer into the past itself, to witness the deeds of the elder days as if they were but yesterday. He claimed he wished to learn the fate of his grandfather, Orofer, who fell at the last alliance. Faramir frowned. And what harm in that? Surely knowledge of the past cannot be accounted evil. Celebdil's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Can it not? Tell me, mortal, if you could witness every moment of pain and sorrow your fathers knew, every mistake they made, every love they lost, would you emerge unchanged? The prince delved too deep into the well of memory, and what he found there drove him to madness. The elf lord raised his hand, and upon it was a ring of dark silver that pulsed with malevolent light. When I refused to aid his mad quest, he struck me down, not with sword or spell, but with this accursed thing he had crafted from the knowledge we unearthed. A ring of memory, he called it, forged in the image of the great ring, but twisted to darker purpose. Gelmir stared at the ring upon Celebdil's finger with growing horror. What does it do? It traps the spirit within the flesh, preventing the natural passage to the halls of Mandos. I am neither living nor dead, bound to this form until the ring is destroyed, or until the end of all things. And worse, I am compelled to serve the will of him who forged it, though my mind remains my own to suffer with. Nimrodel knocked an arrow to her bow, though her hands trembled. Then we shall end your torment here and now. Nay, cried Celebdil, raising his hand. The ring's power protects me from harm, and its destruction would require greater skill than any of you possess. Only its maker can unmake it, or one versed in the deepest lore of Eregion. Faramir stepped forward, his hand upon his sword hilt. Then we must find Prince Thranduil and force him to undo this evil. He has moved beyond your reach, said Celebdil sadly. Even now he journeys to the Grey Havens, seeking passage to the undying lands. He believes that in Valinor he might find the wisdom to master the visions that torment him. The Valar will not suffer such darkness to enter their realm, protested Gelmir. Will they not? The prince carries with him a palantir of his own making, one attuned not to the present but to the past. With it, he has witnessed the music of creation itself, seen the discord that Melkor wrought in the very foundations of the world. Such knowledge weighs heavily upon him, and in his madness he believes only the Valar themselves can lift this burden. The three companions rode hard from Dol Guldur, following the old forest road that led west to the borders of Eriador. Behind them, unseen but felt, came Celebdil, bound by the power of the accursed ring to shadow their steps. The elf lord had become a thing of duty without choice, compelled to aid their quest, though his heart yearned for the peace of death. As they rode, Faramir questioned Gelmir about the prince's youth, seeking to understand how one so noble-born could fall to such darkness. The captain spoke of a young elf filled with curiosity about his heritage, always asking questions about the elder days that his father could not or would not answer. Thranduil was born in the shadow of great deeds, Gelmir explained as they crossed the old forest road. His grandfather Orifer led our people in the last alliance, but fell before the gates of the Barad-dûr through his own pride and haste. His father, King Thrandion, has always been reluctant to speak of those days, for the loss weighs heavily upon him still. Tut! And so the prince sought answers elsewhere, murmured Nimrodel, in old books and forgotten lore. Aye, and when Lord Celebdil came with his discovery in Ostin Edhil, it seemed as though the Valar themselves had answered the prince's prayers. But some knowledge is too terrible to bear. They passed through the misty mountains by the high pass, where the wind sang mournfully through the peaks. Here they met with Elladan and Elrohir, the twin sons of Elrond, who brought word from Rivendell. "Your prince has indeed passed this way," said Elladan, his fair face troubled. "He spoke with our father at length, seeking guidance for his journey west. But Lord Elrond was deeply disturbed by what he saw in the prince's mind." "What did he see?" asked Nimrodel. "Visions," replied Elrohir. "Terrible visions of the elder days, the kinslaying at Alqualanda, the burning of the ships, the curse of Mandos upon the Noldor. The prince has somehow bound himself to witness these events as if he had been present, and the weight of such memories is driving him to despair." At Rivendell, Lord Elrond himself received the companions in his great hall, where the fire burned bright against the gathering winter. The lord of the last homely house was ancient, even among the firstborn, and his eyes held the weight of all the sorrows he had witnessed. "I have seen many fall to the lure of forbidden knowledge," he said, his voice soft as falling rain. "But never have I encountered anything quite like this. Prince Thranduil has somehow created a Palantir that shows not what is, but what was. Through it, he has witnessed the very foundations of evil in this world." Faramir leaned forward in his chair. "Surely knowledge of the past cannot be so dangerous? In Gondor, we study the chronicles of our ancestors to learn wisdom." Elrond's gaze was compassionate but firm. "You study words upon parchment, written by mortal hands and filtered through mortal understanding. The prince experiences these events as if he lived them, feels the emotions of those who were present, bears witness to choices that shaped the fate of all Middle-earth. No mind, however strong, was meant to carry such a burden." "Can anything be done for him?" asked Gelmir desperately. "Perhaps there is one in Valinor who might possess the wisdom to heal such wounds. Nienna, the Lady of Mercy, who alone among the Valar understands the healing power of tears. But the prince must choose healing for himself, and I fear he is too lost in the labyrinth of memory to find his way back to the light." Through the great windows of the hall, they could see the stars beginning to fade as dawn approached. Elrond rose and walked to the eastern window, where the first light touched the peaks of the misty mountains. "There is more," he said quietly. "The ring that binds Celebdil is not the only one. The prince has crafted others, each attuned to different aspects of the past. I sense them spread across Middle-earth, like wounds in the very fabric of time." The revelation struck the companions like a physical blow. Nimrodel was the first to find her voice. "How many others? Where are they?" Elrond turned from the window, his face grave. "I sense at least 6 more, perhaps 7. They are scattered to the winds. One lies in the depths of Khazad-dûm, finding some unfortunate soul to witness the fall of the Dwarodelf. Another rests in the ruins of Dale, and yet another in the Grey Havens themselves. Then we are too late, said Gelmir in despair. If the prince has such power at his disposal, what hope have we of stopping him? Do not abandon hope so easily, counseled Elrond. The prince did not set out to become a Dark Lord. He sought knowledge to heal old wounds, to understand the pain that has haunted his family for generations. That noble intent may yet be our salvation. Celebdil's voice echoed from the shadows where he stood, for even in Rivendell he could not free himself from the compulsion to follow them. The Master did not mean to cause suffering. When he placed this ring upon my finger, tears stood in his eyes. But the knowledge he has gained shows him only the darkness in the world, the price of every victory, the sorrow that lies beneath every joy. Faramir stood and began to pace before the fire. In Gondor, we have a saying, "The past is a country from which no roads lead back." Perhaps that is wisdom your prince would do well to learn. Easily said, replied Elrohir, but when that past contains the fate of one's own blood, the temptation to look backward becomes overwhelming. Elrond nodded slowly. There is truth in both perspectives. The prince seeks to understand his grandfather's fall at the last alliance, but in doing so, he has witnessed every tragedy that led to that moment. The pride of the Noldor, the rebellion against the Valar, the long chain of sorrow that began with Melkor's discord. When the companions reached the Grey Havens, they found the ancient port in uproar. Word had spread that Prince Thranduil had commandeered one of the white ships of the Eldar, demanding passage to the Undying Land, despite the protests of Círdan, the shipwright. The harbor lay shrouded in morning mist that rose from the gray waters like the breath of sea spirit. Tall ships rode at anchor, their swan-shaped prows gleaming with silver inlay, while on the quays, elves moved with the unhurried grace of those who measure time in centuries rather than years. Círdan himself met them at the harbor gate, his beard silver as sea foam and his eyes deep as the ocean depth. "You come seeking Prince Thranduil," he said, without preamble. "I had hoped his kin would arrive, ere he could work further mischief." "Has he sailed?" asked Nimrodel urgently. "Nay, though not for lack of trying. I have refused him passage, for I sense a darkness about him that would not be welcomed in the Blessed Realm. But he has threatened to take ship by force, and there are those among my people who have fallen under the influence of the ring he bared." Even as they spoke, a commotion arose from the harbor proper. A tall figure in robes of deep green strode along the quay, and about him gathered a growing crowd of elves, whose eyes held in strange, distant look. It was Prince Thranduil, but changed. His fair face was gaunt, and his eyes burned with an inner fire that spoke of visions too terrible to bear. In his hand, he carried a sphere of dark crystal that pulsed with its own malevolent light. This was the Palantir he had crafted, the stone of memory that had shown him the shadows of the past, and upon his finger gleamed a ring of silver and jet that marked him as the master of the other accursed band. "My son," called King Thranduil, who had arrived at the havens before them, "put aside this madness and return home." Thranduil turned, and for a moment his eyes cleared. "Father, but no, you cannot be here. I saw you die in the kinslaying at Sirion, pierced by a Noldoran blade, as you tried to protect the children of Elwing." The king's face paled. "I was never at Sirion, my son. That was 3,000 years before my birth. The visions lie to you." "Do they?" Thranduil raised the dark Palantir, and its light grew brighter. "Then look, father, and see the truth of our heritage. See how our people came to these shores, stained with the blood of their kin. The power of the accursed stone spread out like ripples on a dark pool, and all who stood upon the quay were caught in its web. Suddenly, they were no longer in the Grey Haven, but standing on the shores of Alqualond in the elder days, witnessing the first kinslaying of the Eldar. They saw Feanor and his sons demanding ships from the Teleri, saw the refusal and the battle that followed. They felt the despair of those who watched kin slay kin for the first time in the history of the world, and heard the terrible words of the doom of Mandos pronounced upon the Noldor. But more than that, they experienced it as if they themselves were present, felt the weight of every blow struck, every life lost, every tear shed. The vision was so real, so overwhelming, that several of the watching elves fell to their knees in anguish. "Do you see?" cried Thranduil, his voice breaking with the strain of containing such memories. "This is our legacy. This is the price of every fair thing we have built. It is all founded upon bloodshed and betrayal." Gelmir staggered under the weight of the vision, but forced himself to speak. "My lord, these are not our deeds. We did not choose this path, did we not?" Thranduil turned the stone's power upon his old friend, showing him vision after vision: the wars of Beleriand, the fall of Gondolin, the destruction of the two trees. Every step we have taken follows from that first terrible choice. Every joy we have known is built upon the suffering of others. King Thrandion stepped forward, tears streaming down his ancient face. "My son, even if all this is true, what would you have us do? The past cannot be changed." "Cannot it?" Thranduil smiled, and it was a terrible expression. "I have learned much in my studies, father. There are powers in this world that even the Valar fear to touch. With enough of the memory rings, with enough souls bound to my will, I could reach back through time itself and undo the first kinslaying, prevent the rebellion of the Noldor." Celebdil's voice rang out from where he stood, bound by the compulsion of his ring, but still retaining his own will. "You speak madness, Prince. To change the past would unravel the very foundations of creation. And would that be so terrible?" Thranduil raised the stone higher, and its dark light blazed like a malevolent star. "To start anew, without the weight of ancient sorrow, without the curse that has followed us across the sundering seas." It was Faramir who broke the spell, stepping forward with the courage of mortal men who have learned to face death without flinching. The vision of the kinslaying washed over him like a tide, but he was not bound to it as the elves were, for it was not his heritage or his sorrow. "Prince Thranduil," he said, his voice cutting through the wail of ancient grief that filled the air. "I have seen much evil in my time, the madness of Denethor, the corruption of Saruman, the lies of the Dark Lord himself. But I have learned this: those who seek to escape the past by destroying it only create greater evil in the present." Thranduil turned the full power of his gaze upon the mortal man. "What can you know of our pain, son of Earth? Your people live and die in the space of a few short years. You do not carry the weight of millennia." "Perhaps not," Faramir admitted, "but I know the weight of my father's madness, the burden of his despair. And I know that when we let sorrow consume us, we become the very evil we sought to escape." The prince's hand trembled as he held the dark stone. "You do not understand. The visions show me everything, every betrayal, every moment of pain, every price paid for the things we hold dear. How can I live with such knowledge?" "The same way you lived before you possessed it," said a new voice. From the harbor came an elf lord of great majesty, his hair silver gold, and his eyes bright as stars. It was Glorfindel, who had died in Gondolin and returned from the halls of Mandos with wisdom beyond the measure of the firstborn. "Lord Glorfindel," whispered Nimrodel, "but how came you here?" "Elrond sent word of what transpired," replied the elf lord, "and I have some small experience with the weight of terrible memories." He looked directly at Thranduil. "I have stood in the halls of Mandos, Prince, and spoken with those who fell in the kinslaying. Would you know what they said?" Thranduil's grip on the stone tightened. "Tell me their words of condemnation." "They spoke no condemnation," said Glorfindel quietly. "They spoke of hope, of how their sacrifice, terrible though it was, made possible the great deeds that followed, the founding of the kingdoms in exile, the preservation of the Silmaril, the very events that led to Sauron's downfall. They do not regret the part they played in the music, for they see how even discord can serve the greater theme." For a long moment, Prince Thranduil stood frozen upon the quay, the dark palantir blazing in his hands. Around him, the elves caught in his vision began to stir, the spell weakening as doubt crept into his heart. "You would have me accept that the kinslaying was necessary?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I would have you understand that it was inevitable," replied Glorfindel. "Melkor's discord was woven into the music from the beginning, and like all themes in the great song, it serves a purpose we cannot fully comprehend. The Valar do not grieve for the notes that seem discordant, for they hear how they resolve in the greater harmony." King Thrandion stepped closer to his son. "My boy, I know the pain you feel. I too have wondered about the choices our ancestors made, the prices they paid. But we cannot undo the past. We can only choose how we face the future." Celebdil, still bound by the cursed ring, spoke with urgency. "The rings must be destroyed, Prince. The knowledge you have gained was never meant for minds such as ours. Return the dead to their rest, and let the past remain where it belongs." Thranduil looked around at all the faces watching him, his father's love and desperation, Glorfindel's wise compassion, the loyalty of his friends, and for the first time in months, he seemed to truly see them instead of the visions that had consumed him. "I sought only to understand," he whispered, "to know why grandfather died, why our people have suffered so much sorrow." "Understanding is a noble goal," said Círdan, approaching slowly. "But some wisdom comes only with time and acceptance, not through forcing the secrets of the past to yield their mysteries." The prince looked down at the dark stone in his hands, then at the ring upon his finger. With a cry that seemed torn from the depths of his soul, he hurled the palantir into the gray waters of the harbor. It sank without a trace, and with it went the terrible visions that had tormented him. One by one, he removed the other rings from hidden places upon his person. 7 in all, each pulsing with dark power. These too he cast into the sea. And as the last one vanished beneath the waves, Celebdil cried out in joy as the bonds that held him dissolved. "It is finished," the Elf Lord gasped, falling to his knees as the natural order reasserted itself. "I can feel the call of Mandos once more. At last, I can rest." As the sun broke through the morning mist, Celebdil faded like a shadow at noon, his spirit finally free to take the path that had been denied him. The other souls bound by the scattered rings were similarly released. Their torment ended. Prince Thranduil collapsed upon the stones of the quay, weeping for the first time since his ordeal began. King Thrandion gathered his son in his arms, while around them the assembled elves began to sing a song of healing, their voices carrying across the water like the promise of dawn after the longest night. In the days that followed, Prince Thranduil would slowly recover his strength and wisdom. He never again sought to pierce the veils of the past, having learned that some knowledge comes with too high a price. Instead, he turned his attention to the future, helping to heal the wounds that his actions had caused, and working to ensure that the wisdom of the elder days would not be lost, but also not be sought with such desperate hunger. And though the scars of his ordeal never fully faded, they served as a reminder that even the noblest intentions can lead to darkness when pursued without wisdom. The memory rings were gone forever, their power dissolved in the cleansing waters of the sea, and Middle-earth was safer for their passing. Thus ended the tale of elf blood on royal hands, a story of how the weight of the past can crush even the strongest spirit, but also of how love and friendship can call the lost back to the light. For in the end, it is not the sorrows we carry that define us, but the choices we make in spite of them. Epilogue: the healing of ages, the restoration of hope. 5 years hence, when the Malorns of Lothlorien had turned gold thrice more, and the stars wheeled through their ancient courses unchanged, the tale of the memory ring had passed into legend. Yet its echoes still rippled across Middle-earth, like stones cast into still water, each circle touching shores both near and distant. In the halls of King Thrandion, where once shadow and sorrow had held dominion, light returned by degrees. The great chandeliers burned bright once more, their crystal flames reflecting off the mithril-traced pillars that supported the living roof of intertwined branches. Here, in the throne room where first the terrible news had been delivered, Prince Thranduil now sat in council with the wise of many realms. The prince himself was much changed from the tormented soul who had cast his cursed creations into the sea. Though the lines of sorrow never fully faded from his fair features, they had been joined by others. The marks of wisdom earned through suffering, of compassion learned through loss. His eyes, once blazing with the desperate hunger for forbidden knowledge, now held the steady glow of one who had looked into darkness and chosen to turn toward the light. The last of the affected souls has found peace, reported Elrond, his voice carrying the weight of careful vigil. In Khazad-dûm, the spirit of Balin's brother has finally departed to whatever halls await the fathers of the dwarves. The ring that bound him crumbled to dust 3 days past, and with it ended the last echo of your dark creation. Thranduil nodded gravely, his hands folded in his lap, where once they had clutched the terrible stone of memory. And what of the knowledge itself? The lore I discovered in Ost in Edhil, has it been secured? It has been given into the keeping of the White Council, replied Gandalf, who had arrived from his wanderings in the Eastern Lands. Galadriel herself has woven protections about it, that it may not again tempt the unwary. The craft of making Palantiri belongs to the elder days, and the valor alone. We mortals, even we long-lived among the firstborn, lack the wisdom to wield such power without corruption. From the shadows where he preferred to stand, Faramir spoke with the measured tones of one who had governed Ithilien well in the years since the War of the Ring. In Gondor, we have established a new order of lore masters, those who study the past not to change it, but to learn from it. They call themselves the Chroniclers of Acceptance, and their first lesson is this: the past is a teacher, not a master. King Thrandion, his crown now bearing a new jewel of pure crystal that caught and reflected light rather than shadow, leaned forward upon his throne. My son's folly has taught us all a valuable lesson. But tell me, wise ones, what of the greater consequences? The boundaries between past and present were thin stretched by his working. Have they healed completely? It was Glorfindel who answered, his voice carrying the authority of one who had walked in both life and death. Not completely, my lord. In some places, particularly where great sorrows occurred, the veils remain gossamer thin. There are those who report seeing figures from the elder days walking familiar paths, particularly in the ruins of Gondolin and upon the plains before the Black Gate. But these are but shadows, echoes of memory given form. They cannot harm the living, nor can they be harmed in return. And perhaps that is no evil thing, mused Nimrodel, who had taken service in Thranduil's court, as a reminder of the friendship that had saved him. For those who have lost loved ones in the wars, sometimes a glimpse of the dear dead brings comfort rather than sorrow. Gelmir, now bearing new honors as the captain who had helped redeem a prince, shifted in his seat. Yet we must remain vigilant. There are those who might seek to exploit such thin places, to pierce the boundaries for their own purposes. The mouth of Sauron was not the only servant of darkness versed in the manipulation of memory and time. Indeed, agreed Carden, whose ships still sailed between the Grey Havens and the Undying Lands. Word has come from the west that the Valar themselves took note of what transpired here. Manwë has spoken to Arundel, and through him to those of us who still dwell in Middle-earth. The gift of memory is sacred, but it must not become a prison. The past shapes us, but we must not allow it to define our every choice. The wisdom of suffering. As the council continued through the long afternoon, tales were shared of how the crisis of the memory rings had affected distant lands and peoples. From the lonely tower of Orthanc, now cleansed and restored under the watch of the Ents, came word that Saruman's old Palantir had cracked the night Thranduil cast his dark stones into the sea, as if the very concept of seeing stones had recoiled from their perversion. In Rohan, the Horse Lords spoke of a strange phenomenon. Their finest steeds had begun to shy away from certain paths and fields, as if they could sense the lingering echoes of ancient battles. King Éomer had consulted with Gandalf about this, and the wizard had pronounced it a form of healing. The horses were helping to mark places where the boundaries had grown thin, creating natural warnings for the unwary. Even in the Shire, that most peaceful of realms, the effects had been felt. The gaffer, Sam Gamgee, had reported to his mayor that certain old trees in the Old Forest had begun whispering in languages no hobbit could understand, Quenya and Sindarin phrases that spoke of bygone days and forgotten sorrow. But these whispers brought no fear, only a vague melancholy that passed with the dawn. "It seems," observed Elrond with a slight smile, "that your prince's working has made all Middle-earth more aware of its history, not in the overwhelming, crushing manner he experienced, but as a gentle reminder of the great deeds and great sorrows that came before." Thranduil himself spoke for the first time in many minutes, his voice steady but touched with the humility that suffering had taught him. "If some good has come from my folly, then perhaps the price was not paid entirely in vain. Yet I would not wish my torment upon any other soul, not even to purchase such wisdom." "And that itself is wisdom," replied Galadriel, who had arrived silently as was her way, her presence bringing with it the scent of Malorn flowers and the distant music of Lothlorien. "To recognize that knowledge gained through suffering need not be preserved through the continuation of that suffering. This is a lesson many never learn." The Lady of the Golden Wood moved to stand before Thranduil, and as she did, her ring Nenya caught the light from the chandeliers, casting rainbow patterns upon the floor. "I have brought you a gift, Prince of the Woodland Realm, not to replace what you have lost, but to commemorate what you have gained." From the folds of her robes, she withdrew a small crystal sphere, clear as water and bright as captured starlight. Unlike the dark palantir that had tormented him, this stone radiated peace and healing. "This is a memory crystal of the ancient days," she explained. "It holds not visions of the past, but the essence of acceptance, the understanding that all things, even sorrows, serve their purpose in the great music. When darkness threatens to overwhelm you again, as it may in times to come, look into this stone and remember, you are not defined by what you have seen, but by what you choose to do with that seeing." Thranduil accepted the gift with both hands, and as his fingers closed around it, a profound peace settled over his features. "My lady, your kindness is beyond my deserving." "It is not kindness, but necessity," Galadriel replied, "for I have foreseen that your part in the great tapestry is not yet complete. The wisdom you have gained through suffering will be needed in days to come, when others face the same temptations that nearly claimed you. The seeds of tomorrow." As the formal council concluded, and the great lords began to take their leave, Faramir lingered to speak privately with Thranduil. The two had formed an unlikely friendship during the quest to the Grey Havens, bonded by their shared understanding of how noble intentions could lead to terrible consequences. "I have been thinking," the Prince of Ithilien said, as they walked together through the royal garden where silver streams wound between flowering trees, "about what you said regarding the thin places where past and present touch. In Gondor, we have always honored our ancestors through written chronicles and carved monuments, but perhaps there is wisdom in these gentler echoes as well." Thranduil paused beside a fountain carved with images of the two trees, his expression thoughtful. "What do you propose?" "A new tradition," Faramir replied. "Not the forced revelation of hidden truths, but voluntary remembrance. Places where those who wish to honor the past may come to feel the presence of their ancestors without being overwhelmed by it. Halls of memory, we might call them, but memory tempered with acceptance." The idea intrigued the prince, who had spent much time considering how his experience might be turned to constructive purpose. It would require careful preparation and protections to prevent any from delving too deep as I did. Indeed, but think of the comfort it might bring to those who grieve to know that their loved ones live on, not just in their hearts, but in the very fabric of the world itself. As they spoke, Nimrodel approached with news that brought both joy and concern. "My lord, riders have come from the east with strange tidings. In the land of Rhûn, where once the Easterlings made war upon Gondor, there have been sightings of a great tree that was not there a season past. It grows where a particularly terrible battle was fought, and its leaves bear strange patterns that shift and change with the watching. Thranduil and Faramir exchanged glances. This sounded very much like another consequence of the memory ring's destruction, the boundaries between past and present continuing to thin in places of great emotional resonance. "We should investigate," Thranduil said immediately. "If this is connected to my working, then it is my responsibility to ensure it brings healing rather than harm. And I will accompany you," Faramir declared, "for this touches upon the welfare of all the free people, not just your realm alone." But before they could begin planning this new journey, Gandalf approached with a troubled expression. The wizard had been communing with his fellow Maiar since the council's end, and what he had learned gave him cause for concern. "My friends," he said without preamble, "I bring word from Radagast in Rhosgobel, and it is not entirely welcome. He reports that the old places of power, the ruins of Dol Guldur, the graves beneath the Barrow Downs, even the abandoned city of Tharbad, have begun to stir with new activity. Not evil, precisely, but awakened." Thranduil felt a chill of recognition. "The boundaries I weakened are allowing more than just echoes to pass through." "So it would seem," Gandalf agreed. "The past is pressing more strongly against the present, and in some places, the barrier between them has grown permeable indeed. We may find ourselves dealing with more than shadows and memories in the days ahead." The Fellowship of Remembrance. As word of these new developments spread, it became clear that a coordinated response would be necessary. The destruction of the memory rings had solved one crisis, but inadvertently created others, and those who had been involved in the original resolution felt a moral obligation to address these new challenges. Thus was born what the chroniclers would later call the Fellowship of Remembrance, not a formal organization like the White Council, but a loose alliance of those committed to monitoring and managing the consequences of temporal disruption. Prince Thranduil served as its reluctant leader, his experience with forbidden knowledge making him uniquely qualified to recognize the signs of danger. The Fellowship's first major undertaking was the expedition to Rhûn that Thranduil and Faramir had discussed. They were joined by Nimrodel, whose skill with bow and knowledge of the wild ways would prove invaluable, and by Elladan and Elrohir, who brought with them the blessing of their father Elrond and several elven cloaks that would help conceal their passage through lands still suspicious of Western influence. The journey eastward took them through territories that bore the scars of ancient conflicts. As they traveled, they began to notice a pattern. The places where time grew thin were invariably sites of great emotion. Battlefields where heroes had fallen, ruins where hopes had died, crossroads where momentous decisions had been made. It was as if the memory ring, in their destruction, had awakened a sensitivity to emotional resonance that lay dormant in the very foundations of Middle-earth. "We are seeing the world as it truly is," Thranduil mused as they camped one evening beside the ruins of an ancient watchtower, "not just as a collection of physical places, but as a tapestry woven from the deeds and decisions of all who have walked these paths before us." Faramir, who had been studying a map marked with reports of temporal anomalies, looked up from his work. "If that is so, then we may be witnessing the birth of a new age, one in which the wisdom of the past is more readily accessible to those who seek it with pure intent, but also one in which the unwary may be more easily overwhelmed," Nimrodel pointed out. "We have seen what such knowledge did to you, my Lord Prince. How many others might suffer the same fate if these thin places continue to proliferate?" The question haunted them as they continued eastward, following reports of the mysterious tree that had appeared in Rhûn. Along the way, they encountered other manifestations of temporal disturbance. A spring that sometimes reflected not the current sky, but the stars, as they had appeared during the War of the Last Alliance. A stretch of road where travelers occasionally glimpsed the great hosts of Gil-galad marching to their doom. A field where the grass grew in patterns that matched the deployment of armies from battles fought millennia past. In each case, the Fellowship worked to understand and, where necessary, mitigate the effects. Sometimes this meant simply establishing warnings for future travelers. In other instances, It required more complex interventions, the creation of protective wards, the establishment of guided meditation sites where the echoes could be experienced safely, or in extreme cases, the temporary sealing of particularly dangerous temporal rifts. The Tree of All Sorrows. When they finally reached the site of the great tree in Rhûn, they found something beyond their most expansive imaginings. Rising from a battlefield where Gondorian and Easterling armies had clashed in the early days of the Third Age, stood a mallorn of impossible size and beauty, its trunk silver bark, and its leaves shifting through every color known to elvish sight. But this was no ordinary mallorn, for its leaves bore images, scenes from the past played out in living detail upon each golden surface. The companions watched in amazement as leaf after leaf revealed moments from the battle that had been fought here. Gondorian knights falling beneath Easterling spears, women and children fleeing the carnage, acts of heroism and cowardice, mercy and cruelty, all preserved in perfect detail. "It is showing us the true cost of war," whispered Elladan, his face pale with wonder and horror. "Not just the grand strategies and heroic charges, but every individual moment of pain and loss." As they drew closer to the tree, they became aware of figures moving among its roots, not solid forms, but translucent shapes that seemed to exist partially in the present and partially in the past. Some wore the armor of ancient Gondor, others the exotic garb of the Easterlings, but all moved with the slow, purposeful gait of those who sought something precious that had been lost. "They are searching," Thranduil realized with sudden clarity, "the dead of both sides, looking for understanding of why they fell, seeking some meaning in their sacrifice." Faramir stepped forward, his hand upon his sword hilt, not in threat, but in salute. "Honored dead," he called in the common tongue, then repeated the words in Westron and Sindarin. "What would you have of us, the living?" One of the figures turned toward him, a young Gondorian soldier whose ghostly features bore the mark of a spear thrust to the heart. When he spoke, his voice came from far away, like an echo across vast cavern. "We would have remembrance," the spirit said, "not the grand tales that historians write, but the small truth that the Easterling who slew me wept as he did so, for I reminded him of his son. That in our final moments, we were not Gondorians and Easterlings, but simply men who had forgotten why we hated one another." Other spirits gathered around them now, their forms growing more solid as their words were heard and acknowledged. They spoke of final reconciliation between enemies, of shared water given to the dying regardless of which banner they had served, of last words that transcended the boundaries of nation and creed. "This is why the tree grew here," Nimrodel said with dawning understanding, "not to preserve the glory of war, but to honor the humanity that persisted even in its darkest moment." Thranduil approached the great trunk of the tree and placed his hand upon its silver bark. Immediately, images flowed through his mind, not the overwhelming torrent of visions that had nearly destroyed him, but a gentle stream of understanding. He saw the battle not as a clash of good and evil, but as a tragedy born of misunderstanding and pride, where heroes and villains existed on both sides. "The tree offers what my Palantir could not," he said quietly. "Not just knowledge of what happened, but wisdom about what it meant. This is memory, tempered with compassion, the past viewed through the lens of forgiveness. The Guardians of Time." Word of the Tree of All Sorrows spread quickly through the eastern lands, and soon pilgrims began to arrive from every corner of Rhûn and beyond. They came seeking understanding of their own losses, hoping to find meaning in the deaths of loved ones or closure for old grievances. The Fellowship realized that they had stumbled upon something of enormous significance, a new form of healing that could address wounds that had festered for generations. But they also recognized the dangers inherent in such power. Not everyone who approached the tree would be ready for the truths it revealed, and some might seek to exploit its visions for their own purposes. Thus was established the Order of the Guardians of Time, with Prince Thranduil as its first keeper. The Order's mission was twofold: to protect the temporal anomalies from those who would abuse them, and to guide those who sought wisdom to approach these places with proper preparation and pure intent. The Guardians established themselves in a great pavilion near the tree, where they offered counsel to pilgrims and screening to ensure that none approached the visions with hearts full of hatred or desires for revenge. They learned to read the signs of temporal sensitivity, identifying those who might be overwhelmed by direct contact with the past and offering alternative forms of healing. Faramir proved particularly gifted at this work, his experience governing Ithilien having taught him to judge character with keen perception. He developed a series of preparatory meditations that helped pilgrims achieve the proper mindset for receiving the tree's wisdom, while Nimrodel established a network of scouts who could identify new temporal anomalies before they became dangerous. The Elven twins, Elladan and Elrohir, took on the task of cataloging and studying the various manifestations they encountered. Their records would eventually form the basis for a new branch of lore, temporal scholarship, dedicated to understanding how memory and emotion could reshape the very fabric of reality. But it was Thranduil himself who made the most profound discovery during their time at the tree. As he spent hours in communion with its vision, he began to perceive a pattern underlying all the temporal disturbances they had encountered. "The past is not fixed," he announced to his companions one evening as they sat around their fire beneath the star-filled sky. "We have always assumed that what has happened cannot be changed. But I begin to think we misunderstood the nature of time itself." Faramir looked up from the scroll he had been writing, a report on the day's pilgrims and their experiences. "What do you mean?" "The events themselves cannot be altered," Thranduil explained, his eyes reflecting the strange light that emanated from the tree's leaves. "But their meaning, that remains fluid. Each time someone views the past with new understanding, with greater compassion or wisdom, the significance of those events shifts subtly. Not the facts, but the truth." Elladan frowned thoughtfully. "You suggest that remembrance itself is a form of creation? I suggest that the past continues to live and grow through the understanding of those who come after," Thranduil replied. "The tree shows us not what happened, but what it means to us now, filtered through our current wisdom and compassion. In that sense, we are always rewriting history, not its events, but its lessons." This insight would prove crucial in the months that followed, as more temporal anomalies appeared across Middle-earth, and the Fellowship of Remembrance found itself dealing with increasingly complex manifestations of historical echo. The Council of Ages. As the third year of their work drew to a close, the Fellowship received an unexpected summons. Círdan the Shipwright sent word from the Grey Havens that the Valar themselves had taken notice of the temporal disturbances and that a great council was to be held to determine the proper response. The council convened in Rivendell, in the same hall where the fate of the One Ring had once been debated. But this gathering was even more diverse than that famous meeting, for it included not only representatives of the Free People, but also spirits of the departed who had been granted temporary leave from the halls of Mando to share their perspective. Elrond presided over the assembly with his usual grace, but it was clear that even he was troubled by the implications of what they faced. "We gathered to address a question that goes to the very heart of existence in Middle-earth," he began. "Are we witnessing a natural evolution in the relationship between past and present, or a dangerous disruption that threatens the order of all things?" The debate that followed was unlike any in the recorded history of the Elder Day. Galadriel spoke for the elves, arguing that the increased permeability between time was a sign that Middle-earth was preparing for its final transition to the dominion of men. "The firstborn have always been more closely bound to memory and the distant past. As our time wanes, it is natural that these bonds should loosen, allowing the echoes of our deeds to remain as guides for those who come after." Gandalf, speaking with the authority of one of the Maiar, offered a different perspective. "This is indeed a time of transition, but one that was set in motion by the princes working rather than by the natural order. We must consider whether to allow these changes to continue, or to take steps to restore the previous boundary." The most startling voice came from an unexpected source. the spirit of Gil-galad himself, the last High King of the Noldor, who had been granted leave to attend the council. His presence filled the hall with silver light as he spoke. "I have walked in the deathless lands since my fall before the Black Gate," the ancient king said, his voice carrying the wisdom of ages spent in contemplation. "From that perspective, I can tell you that the boundary between life and death, past and present, has always been more fluid than the living realize. What you are experiencing now is not an aberration, but a revelation, a glimpse of how time truly flows when not constrained by the limitations of mortal perception." King Thrandion, who had traveled from his woodland realm for this momentous gathering, asked the question that weighed on all their minds. "And what of the dangers, Lord Gil-galad? We have seen how the unrestricted flow of temporal knowledge nearly destroyed my son. How can we ensure that these revelations bring wisdom rather than madness?" Gil-galad's ghostly form turned toward Prince Thranduil, who sat quietly among the assembly. "The danger lies not in the knowledge itself, but in the manner of its acquisition. Your son sought to force the past to yield its secrets, to master time rather than learning from it. Those who approach these new thin places with humility and acceptance will find healing. Those who come with demands and expectations will find only torment." The Great Choice. The council continued for 7 days and 7 nights, with perspectives offered from every realm and people. The dwarves, speaking through Gimli, son of Glóin, worried that the temporal disturbances might awaken ancient grudges and old feuds better left buried. The hobbits, represented by Mayor Sam Gamgee himself, expressed concern for the simple folk who might stumble upon these thin places without understanding their significance. On the final day, as dawn broke over the valley of Rivendell, a consensus began to emerge. Rather than attempting to restore the previous order or allowing the disturbances to spread unchecked, they would establish a middle path, one that honored both the wisdom of the past and the needs of the present. The solution they devised was both elegant and practical. The Fellowship of Remembrance would be formally chartered as the Guardians of Time, with authority to monitor and manage temporal anomalies throughout Middle-earth. Certain locations would be designated as sanctuaries of memory, places where the thin boundaries would be maintained and protected, allowing those who sought wisdom to commune safely with the echoes of the past. Other sites would be carefully sealed, their temporal rifts closed to prevent accidental contact by the unprepared. A new order of lore masters would be trained to recognize the signs of temporal sensitivity and to guide those who showed such gifts toward proper training and understanding. Most importantly, the Council established the Covenant of Ages, a solemn agreement that bound all the Free Peoples to respect the sanctity of memory while guarding against its abuse. The past would be honored and preserved, but never again would anyone seek to bind the dead to their will or force the flow of time to serve mortal purpose. Prince Thranduil was formally appointed as the first Guardian Prime, a position that carried both great honor and terrible responsibility. He would spend the remainder of his long life traveling Middle-earth, establishing and maintaining the sanctuaries of memory, training new guardians, and ensuring that the wisdom of the past remained accessible to those who sought it with pure hearts. The legacy of wisdom. In the years that followed the Council of Ages, the sanctuaries of memory became places of pilgrimage and healing throughout Middle-earth. The great tree of all sorrows in Rhûn was joined by others. The pool of reflection in the ruins of Ostin Edhil, where the craft of the rings was remembered with both wonder and warning. The stone circle of Weathertop, where the echoes of ancient watchers still kept vigil against the dark. The memorial garden of Pelennor Field, where the spirits of the fallen offered comfort to those who grieved for losses both old and new. Each sanctuary was carefully tended by guardians trained in the delicate art of managing temporal boundary. They learned to read the signs that indicated when someone was ready for deeper communion with the past and when such contact might prove harmful. They developed rituals of preparation and protection, ceremonies that honored the dead while safeguarding the living. The work was not without its challenges. There were those who sought to exploit the sanctuaries for personal gain, attempting to extract specific knowledge or to commune with particular individuals from the past. Others came driven by obsession or madness, hoping to find in the echoes of history what they could not create in their present lives. But for every failed seeker, there were dozens who found genuine healing and wisdom. Veterans of the Great Wars found peace in understanding the perspectives of their former enemies. Children who had lost parents gained comfort from sensing their presence in the flow of memory. Scholars and lore masters discovered insights that had been lost for centuries, preserved in the living memory of the earth itself. Perhaps most remarkably, the sanctuaries began to serve as bridges between the different peoples of Middle-earth. At the Tree of All Sorrows, former enemies discovered shared experiences of loss and love. In the Memorial Garden, Gondorians and Rohirrim found common ground in their grief for the fallen. Even the dwarves, traditionally secretive about their history, established a sanctuary deep in the reclaimed halls of Khazad-dûm, where the echoes of ancient kings offered wisdom to their descendants. The price of memory. Yet Prince Thranduil never forgot the price he had paid for his insights, nor did he allow others to forget it. At each sanctuary, a simple stone monument bore the same inscription: "Remember that memory is a gift, not a right. Approach with humility, or depart in peace." The prince himself bore other, more personal reminders of his ordeal. Though he had found healing and purpose in his work as Guardian Prime, he remained forever changed by his experience with the memory ring. He could never again view the past with the innocence of ignorance, could never forget the weight of accumulated sorrow that lay beneath even the most joyful moments of history. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of night, when he kept vigil at one of the sanctuaries, he would take out the memory crystal that Galadriel had given him. Its clear light would remind him that understanding and acceptance could transform even the darkest knowledge into wisdom, that the goal was not to forget the sorrows of the past, but to bear them with grace. He often thought of Lord Celebdil, whose torment had finally ended when the cursed rings were destroyed. The Elf Lord had found peace at last, but his suffering had served a purpose. It had shown Thranduil and his companions the true cost of trying to master time rather than learning from it. The Fellowship of Remembrance continued to meet each year on the anniversary of the ring's destruction, gathering at the Grey Havens, where Círdan's wisdom had helped guide them through their darkest hour. They would share news of new sanctuaries established, of guardians trained, of wisdom gained, and dangers averted. Faramir would speak of the chroniclers of acceptance in Gondor, whose careful documentation of the lessons learned from temporal anomalies was creating a new form of historical scholarship. Nimrodel would report on the network of scouts and wardens who watched for unauthorized attempts to access dangerous sites. The Elven Twins brought word from the various libraries and archives where the Fellowship's discoveries were being preserved for future generations. And each year, as they raised their cups in a toast to the memory of Celebdil and all who had paid the price for their understanding, Prince Thranduil would renew his vow to ensure that no one else would suffer as he had suffered, that the wisdom of the past would remain a source of healing rather than torment. The turning of the tide. As the Fourth Age deepened and the dominion of men became more firmly established, the nature of the sanctuaries began to evolve. Where once they had been primarily places for elves and the other elder races to commune with their ancient heritage, they increasingly served the shorter-lived peoples who sought to understand their place in the great sweep of history. The race of men, with their mortal urgency and passionate natures, brought a different energy to the sanctuaries. They did not seek the long perspective of the elves or the deep stability of the dwarves, but rather the immediate wisdom that could help them make the most of their brief span of years. Under their influence, new forms of sanctuary emerged. The Circle of Choices at the crossroads of Kalinhard showed visitors the potential consequences of major decisions, helping them understand how individual choices rippled through time. The Grove of Reconciliation near Lake Evendim specialized in healing old family feud and generational conflict that had been passed down through mortal bloodline. Prince Thranduil found himself adapting his method to serve these new pilgrims. Where elves might spend months in contemplation before approaching a temporal echo, humans often needed guidance that could be completed in days or weeks. The Guardians developed new techniques for condensing the essential wisdom of the past into forms that mortal minds could grasp and apply. Yet the fundamental principles remained unchanged: respect for the dead, humility before the mysteries of time, and the understanding that memory was meant to heal rather than to wound. These became the cornerstones of a new tradition that would outlast even the long lives of the elves. The final voyage, the end of the tale, came, as it must for all the firstborn in Middle-earth, with the call of the sea. As the Fourth Age entered its second century, Prince Thranduil felt the weariness that comes to even the elves after long labor in the service of others. His work as Guardian Prime was nearly complete. The sanctuaries were established, the Order trained and tested, the wisdom of temporal healing firmly rooted in the traditions of Middle-earth. King Thranduil had already departed for the Undying Land, his final years in Middle-earth made peaceful by the knowledge that his son had found redemption and purpose. Galadriel and Elrond had long since taken ship from the Grey Haven, bearing with them the ancient wisdom of the elder days. Now it was Thranduil's turn to follow that timeless path. But unlike his father, who had sailed in simple weariness, the prince carried with him a deeper understanding of what lay behind and what lay ahead. His experience with the memory rings had shown him that time was not a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean in which all moments existed simultaneously, connected by currents of meaning and consequence. On his final day as Guardian Prime, Thranduil gathered his successors at the Tree of All Sorrow, where his journey into forbidden knowledge had ultimately led to wisdom. Faramir, now aged and gray but still bearing the clear eyes of the just, would take over the coordination of the sanctuaries in the lands of men. Nimrodel would maintain watch over the wild places where temporal anomalies might yet appear. A new generation of elven guardians, trained in the principles their master had discovered through such painful experience, would carry on the work in the years to come. "Remember," he told them as the sun set behind the great tree's silver branches, "that we are not the masters of time, but its servants. Our role is not to judge the past or to control the future, but to help others find their place in the great song that began before the foundations of the world and will continue long after we have passed into legend." See, as if in response to his words, the leaves of the tree began to shimmer with a new vision, not of the ancient battle that had raged here, but of the sanctuaries spread across Middle-earth, of the thousands who had found healing and wisdom in their precincts, of the peace that could come when the past was honored rather than feared. The vision expanded to show the future as well, generations yet unborn who would learn from the mistakes and triumphs of their ancestors, who would build upon the foundation of wisdom that the Guardians had established. Wars that would be prevented through understanding, feuds that would be ended through forgiveness, knowledge that would be preserved and passed down not as burden but as gift. "This is the true legacy of the memory ring," Thranduil said softly. "Not the torment they caused, but the healing they ultimately made possible. From the greatest folly can come the greatest wisdom, if we have the courage to learn from our mistakes." The sunset shore. At the Grey Haven, Círdan awaited with a ship of white timber and silver sail. The old shipwright's eyes held the depth of all the farewells he had witnessed, all the partings that had carried the elves westward toward the light beyond the world. "So, Prince Thranduil," Círdan said, as they walked together along the quay, where so much of this tale had played out, "do you sail in hope or in sorrow?" Thranduil considered the question carefully, his hand touching the memory crystal that still hung at his chest. "In gratitude," he replied at last, "for the chance to transform suffering into service, knowledge into wisdom, memory into healing." As the ship prepared to depart, the other members of the original fellowship came to see him off. Faramir embraced him as a brother, thanking him for the friendship that had sustained them both through dark time. Nimrodel offered him a bough of Malorn wood, carved with protective runes for the journey ahead. Even Gandalf appeared, his gray robes bright in the harbor light, to offer words of blessing. "Your chapter in the great story is ending," the wizard said, "but the story itself continues. The wisdom you have gained will echo through the ages, helping others to find their way when the path grows dark." As the ship caught the western wind and moved away from the shore, Prince Thranduil stood at the stern, watching Middle-earth recede into the distance. The last he saw was the Tree of All Sorrows, its silver trunk gleaming in the twilight, its leaves bearing their eternal testimony to the truth that even the greatest sorrows could be transformed into sources of healing. And in that moment, as the ship passed beyond the sight of mortal eyes, Prince Thranduil finally understood the lesson that his long ordeal had been meant to teach. The past was not a prison to be escaped or a treasure to be hoarded, but a teacher to be honored. Memory was not meant to burden the living with the weight of ancient sorrows, but to guide them toward wisdom and compassion. The memory rings were gone, their dark power dissolved in the cleansing waters of the sea, but their true legacy remained. The understanding that time itself was sacred, that every moment held the potential for either creation or destruction, and that those who sought to serve, rather than to master, would find in memory not a curse, but a blessing. Thus ended the tale of elf blood on royal hand, with the prince who had nearly been destroyed by his hunger for forbidden knowledge finally achieving the peace that comes with true understanding. The sanctuaries of memory continued to offer healing to all who sought it with pure hearts, and the Order of Guardians maintained their vigil through all the long years that followed. And sometimes, when the mist rose from the gray havens at twilight, sailors claimed they could still see a white ship on the horizon, carrying its passenger toward the light beyond the world, where past and present and future are one, and where all sorrows find their ultimate resolution in the great music that encompasses all things. The waves whispered his name as they touched the shore, Thranduil, the Redeemed, Guardian Prime, Keeper of Sacred Memory. And in that whispered remembrance, his true victory was complete.